All right, so we're diving into going to college today. You gave this one to me, and I gotta say, Eric DeRise is not holding back.
No, he is not. It's refreshing, actually.
Right. Like, it's one thing to put together the classic, here's how to get good grades and write a good essay guide. But he goes deeper. Like,
Yeah.
right off the bat, he throws in this insider perspective since he's worked in admissions.
Yeah, that definitely adds a level of, okay, he's seen behind the curtain kind of thing.
Exactly. And that leads right into his first hack, which I found fascinating. Do your research before you even talk to a college? Like, isn't that what guidance counselors are for?
Right, you'd think so. But DeRise tells the story about these med school hopefuls, and it's like a reality check. He says a lot of them hadn't even Googled the difference between like a cardiologist and a neurologist. They just wanted someone to hand them a plan.
Wow. So it's not just about getting into college. It's about making sure you even want what that path leads to.
Totally. And I think DeRise is getting at this bigger issue of information overload. We're bombarded with choices these days. It's tempting to just look for the shortcut. But like he says, taking the time to really research to understand your options, that's crucial.
It's like he's saying taking ownership of your education. That starts way before you ever step foot on campus.
Absolutely. And he doesn't let up on that. Like when he gets to accreditation, he goes there.
Right. Regional versus national. I'll admit, I didn't even fully get that distinction before.
Most people don't. They just assume national sounds fancier, more prestigious. But DeRise points out how that can really backfire, especially if you might transfer credits later.
He even calls some admissions advisors salespeople in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, that's DeRise for you. He doesn't sugarcoat it, and honestly, I think that's what makes his advice so valuable. You gotta be your own advocate. Question everything. Especially when it comes to something as important as your education.
You can't just take things at face value. You gotta do your homework. And that leads us to what might be the most controversial part of the book, his take on community college.
Definitely raise some eyebrows, I'm sure.
Because there's still this stigma around it, like it's somehow lesser.
Right, which is exactly what DeRise challenges. He basically flips the script and says, look, community college for those first 2 years, that might be the smarter move.
So instead of seeing it as a fallback, he's saying it could be the strategic advantage.
Think of it like building a house. You don't start with a fancy roof. You need that solid foundation. And DeRise argues that's what those core classes at a community college can give you.
And let's not forget the financial side of things. He brings up those lifetime limits on financial aid, which honestly more people need to be aware of.
Huge point. Those first 2 years, they have a much bigger impact long term than we often realize.
He's really pushing us to think ahead, not just about getting into college, but about setting ourselves up for success down the road.
Which is ultimately what it's all about, right? And this is where things get really interesting, because DeRise takes this unexpected turn and dives into the history of higher ed, like full-on history lesson.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I saw that in the table of contents, I was like, okay, is this really necessary? But then I got into it, and wow, he totally makes the case for why it matters.
He does. He's really good at connecting those dots. Like, he starts by asking this simple question, where did the middle class even come from?
Right, which you might not think is related to college. But he brings it back around to the GI Bill and how that single piece of legislation transformed everything.
Totally, because before that, a college education, it was basically for the elite, for the wealthy. The GI Bill changed the game. It opened those doors for veterans, no matter their background.
And what I found fascinating was how he talks about the ripple effects, how it wasn't just about those individual veterans getting an education.
Yeah.
It was about this huge cultural shift.
Exactly, a more educated workforce. That leads to economic growth,
Yeah.
which then fuels social mobility. It's like this domino effect.
And DeRise doesn't shy away from the challenge either, like how college classrooms themselves had to adapt.
Yeah.
Suddenly you've got all these older students, many of them fresh from combat, mixing with the typical 18-year-olds.
Can you imagine that dynamic? Talk about a culture clash. But it forced those institutions to evolve, to rethink how they did things. And I think that speaks to a bigger point that DeRise makes throughout the book. Education, it's not static, it's always changing, always responding to the world around it.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate how far we've come, even with all the hand-wringing about the state of education today.
For sure. And understanding that historical context, it helps us see the challenges not as these insurmountable roadblocks, but as opportunities for growth, for adaptation. And speaking of adaptation, that leads us to another really interesting part of the book, DeRise's take on learning theory.
Okay, I'll be honest. When I first saw learning theory as a chapter title, I thought, is this going to be too academic? But DeRise does a good job of making it relevant to everyone. Like he's saying, before you even think about choosing a college or a major, You need to understand how you learn best.
Exactly. What works for one person might not work for another. And he brings up this idea of digital natives versus digital immigrants, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah, it's like a light bulb moment. You realize, oh, that's why I approach learning differently than my kids or even than my parents.
Right. DeRise argues that those digital natives, the ones who grew up surrounded by technology, they learn differently than previous generations. They process information differently. They communicate differently. Even the way they approach problem solving is different.
And that brings up a big question, right? Like, how much has our education system actually adapted to these digital natives? Because let's face it, a lot of what we consider traditional education, it's still pretty stuck in the past.
Definitely still clinging to those old models. And DeRise doesn't shy away from calling that out. Like, he flat out says he thinks all K-12 students should have to take some online classes.
Which is interesting because there's still some resistance to that, like online learning. Some people see it as less rigorous.
Right. But DeRise argues it's not about the where of learning. It's about preparing students for a world where digital fluency is non-negotiable. It's not just a tech industry thing anymore. No matter what you do, you're going to be interacting with technology, solving problems in a digital space.
It's like that whole everyone should learn to code argument from a few years back. But DeRise is taking it a step further. It's not just about coding. It's about navigating the digital landscape, thinking critically about the information that's thrown at us, being adaptable. Those are the skills that are going to matter.
And those are skills that traditional education often doesn't do a great job of teaching. So DeRise is making the case that we need to start incorporating these things early on. Make it part of the core curriculum, not just an elective or something kids do in their free time.
It's like you said earlier, taking ownership of your education. Well, that goes for institutions too.
Right.
They have to take ownership of preparing students for the world as it is, not how it used to be.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to this bigger idea of adapting to a changing world, which DeRise does such a good job of illustrating, from those practical tips, those hacks, to the historical perspective, to this deep dive into how we learn. It all connects.
It really does. It's given me a lot to think about. And I hope it's done the same for you listening. Because at the end of the day, that's what DeRise wants us to do, to think critically, to question assumptions, and to really engage with this idea of education as a lifelong pursuit.
Because it's not just about getting that degree. It's about what you do with it, how you apply that knowledge, how you continue to learn and grow long after you've left the classroom.
And in a world that's changing as rapidly as ours, that ability to adapt, to keep learning, that might be the most valuable skill of all.